All right, to look at our next to the last set of notes for evolution, we want to kind of circle back and think a little bit about the activity that we just completed, and also, again, tie back to a little bit of Darwin's work from Activity 4. Remembering that natural selection is the process by which heritable traits, again, things that are genetically capable of being passed on, help an organism to survive and successfully produce, so that the particular gene becomes more common in a population over several generations. And again, if you haven't noted this at this point, natural selection is the key mechanism for evolution. Favorable traits mean that you are able to survive. The prize for survival is reproduction. The prize for reproduction is passing on those traits, and that continues to loop in a circle. I want you to stop and think a little bit about how the antibiotic resistant lab ties into natural selection and some of Darwin's work. Okay, if you weren't able to come up with a couple of ways that you could link natural selection to antibiotic resistance, I would certainly make a note off to the side so that you can ask questions about that as we continue or discuss questions tomorrow. Coming back to Darwin, again, the whole premise of his work had several parts to it. The first part is that typically more offspring would be born than can be supported by food, resources, and then the offspring that do survive compete for survival. They compete for those resources. So again, the ones that are have the traits that are most favorable to that particular environment are the ones that survive and pass on that genetic information. Within a population or a species, there are going to be different traits, and you will also see individual variation within that. That doesn't mean that individuals evolve. It just means that you have variation from individual to individual within a species. A couple of sources of variation that we've talked about before. Mutations, and I don't want you to get in the habit of thinking that mutations are the answer to everything, simply because they're not. Mutations are fairly rare, and if you think about why they are fairly rare, go back to when we talked about DNA replication and all of those checkpoints that DNA has to make sure that the bases are lined up correctly. If there are mistakes, there are spell checkers to catch those mistakes. So again, mutations aren't exceptionally common, but they do happen. A little bit more common is sexual recombination, and that happens in a variety of ways, through independent assortment during meiosis, crossing over during prophase 1 of meiosis, and then just the process of fertilization as it is. Remember, fertilization is an egg from one individual being fertilized by sperm from another individual, and that combination provides variation within a population. Okay, and again, we talked about this as to what natural selection is. The prize for being suited for the environment is reproduction, and the prize for reproduction is passing on those traits. The consequences of not being fit is death. Again, I've mentioned that before. And if you're dead, you're not reproducing. And if you're not reproducing, you're not passing on those genes. So those genes that tend to not make you adaptable or fit to the environment as a result don't get passed along. So as a result, what you end up with is accumulating favorable traits in a population over time. And again, that's a little bit more of a scientific definition of evolution, accumulating favorable traits over time. One of the things that Darwin thought is that evolution was a fairly slow process. But as we've seen with antibiotic resistance with bacteria, it's actually a process that happens fairly quickly. Again, going back to the rock pocket mouse activity, again, within 10 generations, you were able to see change in genotype and phenotype because mice reproduce very quickly and they have lots of offspring. So organisms that tend to have some of those types of traits help them through the evolution process perhaps a little bit better because they have excess, there's excess reproduction and excess offspring. Okay, couple of quick things. Populations evolve, individuals don't. So don't forget that. When we talk about a population, we're talking about a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Okay, so there could be a population of you in one house and a population of your clones in another house. But notice the key that keeps you from being the same population is you're not living in the same house. So you would still be a species, but those would be two different populations. We've talked about this before, but individuals don't evolve. Think about, again, me as an example. I would certainly not choose this height as something that I would keep as a trait. I would certainly will myself to be taller if I could. But again, because individuals don't evolve, that's not possible. And again, this happens over over generations. Again, it might be worth writing down. This used to be something that we thought took an extremely long period of time, but we've started to see many examples of organisms that evolve fairly quickly in a short amount of time. Okay, there are two types of evolutionary change. And this should be something really easy for you to remember. Microevolution is honestly what it says. Evolutionary changes on a very small scale. And a good example of that is gene frequency. So the rock pocket mouse, is a great example of this, because you saw changes in the allele frequencies, the black versus white, again, in a fairly short amount of time. So microevolution looks at small changes. You can see at the bottom, the diagram and the one that's on the right-hand side, it shows both micro and macroevolution. But microevolution, this is again very similar to what we saw in the rock pocket mouse. You notice there were subtle changes in the color of this lizard, and that is most likely driven by allele frequencies, some change in the environment, which makes this guy stand out more. Perhaps he gets eaten more. A whole variety of things could be happening, and as a result, you see a shift. Same thing with the bug that's sitting on the leaf. I'm guessing that there were some brown counterparts that were floating around at some point, and those brown counterparts stood out pretty significantly against that green leaf, and as a result were eaten, leaving the green allele to be something that became more dominant in the population. And again, really easy to remember, macro means large. And these are going to be things like speciation events. If you look at the diagram right here, you can see a phylogenetic tree. And from a common ancestor at the bottom, you end up with a variety of species of different organisms. And the same thing is true over on the right-hand side. When you look vertically, you can see that you have one species of lizard that has branched out, even though they show it in a linear fashion, to something that is more bird-like. Please, as you look at this vertical progression, please don't use the term that the lizard evolved into the bird, because that is not the case. Again, as the environment changed and something was more favorable to being able to run on two legs or to be able to fly, that particular trait is the one that was passed on because it was favorable. Okay, when we talk about microevolution, again, remember these are small changes that happen generally on allele frequencies. And again, we're talking about the fork bird activity. Go back, and you may want to write this out to the side. That fork bird activity, the rock pocket mouse, are both examples of ways that we have seen microevolution occur in class. And there's a couple of different ways that that can happen in looking at how genetics change. And the first is genetic drift. And in this, what happens, populations shrink. There's a couple different examples of this. One is called a bottleneck. In a bottleneck, usually some natural disaster happens, kills a large number of individuals, and as a result, kind of shrinks the gene pool. So there are fewer alleles that are left to be passed on to future generation. As a result of that, you end up with lower genetic variability in the population because some of those alleles, due to the death, whatever the disaster was, has removed those alleles from the gene pool. And gene pool is just the alleles that are in a population. We've used that word several times in class. So just to give you a little bit of a clear definition as you look at that. A really good example of genetic drift are cheetahs. Cheetahs were once really widespread, both in Africa and Asia, and their numbers have been significantly decreased, mostly due to humans. Loss of habitat, poaching are two of the big ones. So there are only a few of these cheetahs that exist in the wild. And as a result, they have really, really, really low genetic variability. And so as a result of that, the cheetahs that are left are being put into nature preserves, which increases the chance for the spread of disease because of proximity, and also because they don't have a whole lot of genetic variability, they have reduced capacity to adapt and survive any environmental changes that may happen. And again, if you think a little bit about how often the environment changes with climate change, this could be a significant challenge for organisms like cheetahs who have had their populations decrease significantly and as a result have low genetic variability as well. This is kind of a nice little diagram of what the bottleneck effect looks like. The thing that I like is that the top of this kind of shows this little tiny part would be a fire, an earthquake, a natural disaster. It could be deforestation, any of those things. And if you look within this original population, you have 3 different alleles that are represented. You have a white one, a blue one, and a yellow one. After this particular population goes through this bottlenecking event, you can see that the yellow allele has been completely removed from the population, and this poor white one has been reduced to only having one particular allele left. So as a result, the likelihood of ending up with organisms that only have these blue alleles is pretty significant. And again, it results from organisms being, first of all, population size reduced, and then being pushed into areas where they don't have as much opportunity to interbreed with other organisms from other locations to increase that genetic variability. Another example of microevolution would be something called the founder effect. And this is just where like a few individuals might colonize a habitat, and then the new population gene pool will be different from the parent population that was originally there. So this could be, for example, like birds that fly into or are blown off course and end up on an island. Those birds survive and reproduce, and as a result, you end up with a different population of birds from what was originally on the island. Sometimes with the founder's effect, this could end up being something that is natural disaster related, or sometimes it just could be that an organism gets confused, stops in the wrong place in a migration pattern, and ends up staying where it's at and then flourishing. Gene flow is the gain or loss of alleles when individuals immigrate or emigrate in a population. Okay, so remember, into and out of populations, both of these sound alike but are spelled differently, immigration and emigration. And basically, this tends to reduce the differences between populations. So a really good example of this is that when Alexander the Great moved to India from Greece, the genes for green eyes are pretty common in the Greek population. However, it's not significantly, or was not significantly noticeable in India at the time. However, as these two populations of people interbred, we ended up seeing more green-eyed individuals show up in the Indian population as well. And then last but not least, mutations are a way that microevolution can occur. Please, I mentioned this before, this is not very common. However, they can have a cumulative effect over several generations, and mutations are the original source of genetic variation. So scientists are able to track back some of those original mutations and start to see how they increase genetic variation from the beginning. The key thing is that microevolution doesn't necessarily lead to the evolution of a new species. Natural selection is the mechanism for a new species to evolve. So that's the key thing to remember in this process, is that microevolution won't always give you a new species. It may make the population that you have more fit for the environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you get a new species out of this. Okay, and last but not least, just a little bit of a summary. Evolution refers to the process of cumulative changes of things that can be inherited in a population. No change in allele frequencies mean no evolution is occurring. Big changes in allele frequency means that evolution has occurred. This should be something that you are familiar with from talking about Hardy-Weinberg. Again, back in, I believe it was activity 93 with the fork birds, and then the rock pocket mice in activity 12. So again, just to kind of summarize a little bit about what evolution is. And in order for evolution to occur, you do need to have some changes in allele frequency to drive that natural selection process.